There is something scary hiding in this swamp. Welcome back, Charlie here. Swamps can be rather yucky places, but as you'll soon see, they can also be very scary. From unexplained swamp discoveries to bizarre creatures found living inside swamps. First, we have to look at this swamp sinkhole. This video will be enough to make you never want to go near a swamp again. Many don't realize this, but you can easily lose your life in a swamp, especially if you get caught up in a swamp sinkhole. Take a look at this video from 2020. Two simultaneous swamp sinkholes opened up at once. This took place in Bomed County, Kenya. The swamp sinkhole swallowed up everything in sight. But what actually caused this? Well, it turned out limestone was below this swamp, and that limestone was rapidly eroding. As the limestone dissolved, the water kept getting deeper and deeper, creating a swirling sinkhole effect. If anyone was swimming in the swamp at the time, they would be sucked underneath, and likely would have not made it out alive. But thankfully in this case, no one was pulled underneath. Next, we have to look at this swamp monster. In 2021, some friends are rowing a small boat. They're making their way through a swamp at night. The water seems still and peaceful, but that's when one of the people on the boat puts their hand into the murky water. He quickly pulls it back out and says something grabbed him. The men are freaked out but assume it's some sort of fish. The men then see something glowing in the water. It looks like a creature with lights on it. Then after a few moments, this happens. It seems like some kind of blue hand emerges from the water. I've slowed down and enhanced this video so we can take a better look. The hand seems to have 5 fingers, but they're all the same length, meaning this is not a human. Some speculate this could be a cenophore of some kind. That's because cenophores have glowing lights. And right before this man, the men saw lights in the water. Others say this may be some kind of eel, but this video's over a year old and we still don't know what this is. Online, many said this was a real-life swamp monster, but what do you think this could be? Moving on, we have to look at these creepy dolls. In October of 2014, a police chief was driving next to a swamp. That's when he saw a sight that made his jaw drop. He saw what looked like porcelain dolls in the swamp. This was in Bear Creek Swamp in Alabama. The cop, Joe Sedinger, was creeped out but decided to drive on. But a few days later, he began receiving phone calls from creeped out locals. People kept reporting seeing scary figures in the swamp. So Joe and his other cops went to investigate. In the swamp, they found 21 very creepy porcelain dolls. These had been stuck onto bamboo stakes, and many of them had their faces removed. The police chief decided to post about this on social media. He asked if anyone had any information about these dolls, but no one ever came forward. Eventually, the case was closed, but it remains one of Alabama's creepiest unexplained mysteries. Moving on, we have to look at this plane. Believe it or not, this plane has a name. It's named Swamp Ghost. In 1942, the USA got involved in World War II. It began using heavy bomber planes. During this, one of their US B-17E bombers was shot with bullets, causing the plane to crash land into a swamp in Papua New Guinea. Miraculously, all 9 crew on board survived, but had to spend 6 weeks living in the swamp. They had to battle lack of food and water, as well as heat exhaustion and malaria. But after these 6 weeks, the 9 soldiers finally made it to safety. But their plane was lost for decades in the swamp. But 30 years later, Australian soldiers were flying overhead. They were flying over Papua New Guinea in a helicopter. That's when they saw something submerged in a swamp. When they landed to check it out, they realized it was a plane, and nicknamed it Swamp Ghost. The US Army then decided to retrieve the plane. It was very difficult because at this point the swamp had been infested with crocodiles. But amazingly, they got this old plane back to the USA, and it's now on display at a museum in Hawaii. Next, I have to show you this giant snake. In 2020, 2 men made a record-breaking discovery in a Florida swamp. They found an 18-foot Burmese python, the largest python ever found in the USA. In total, the snake was 18 feet and 9 inches. But how did a Burmese python python even end up in Florida? You see, people used to keep these as pets, but over the years they escaped or were released on purpose. And over the last 15 years, the Burmese snake population has skyrocketed in Florida. They're now wild animals in the state, and snake catchers like these two guys make lots of money from catching them. They can make up to $150 per snake captured. That is, if you have the guts to do it. They document their snake captures on their channel, Snakeaholic. The massive python weighed 63.5 kilos, meaning these two men couldn't even hold it up. Burmese pythons are a deadly species, so these men were literally risking their lives. But I guess $150 is $150. Moving on, we have to look at these swamp creatures. In 2012, some people were walking near a swamp in Seney, France. That's when they saw these very creepy figures in the swamp. The creatures were thin and appeared to be frozen in time. It almost looked like they'd been covered in mud and clay. But what were these creatures? And what were they doing in a French swamp? Well, it turned out these were sculptures. They were apparently created to reflect man's complicated relationship with nature. The figures were made with iron, mud, and algae. They were then left to dry, making the mud look like skin. These creatures really are terrifying. Even if they're not living things, just imagine seeing one of these at night. Moving on, we have to look at this mysterious cemetery. In 1982, road workers stumbled across something scary in Utah, USA. While digging in a swamp, they found many skulls. At first, they thought it was a murder site, but experts found the skulls were not recent. After looking more, they discovered the remains of 168 people. Thanks to the swamp, the skulls had been well preserved, allowing experts to find out the skulls were from the Archaic period. That's around 500 BC. Moving on, we have to look at a tank. The tank was found in Estonia in the year 2000, and amazingly the tank still worked. 116 shells were even found inside. But there was one mystery about this tank. It was a T-34 Soviet tank, but for some reason it had German markings. It turned out the German army had stolen this from the Soviet army, and then used it as one of their own tanks for many years. That was before they got it stuck in a swamp. It's believed this was actually done on purpose. The Soviets were advancing into Estonia, so to make sure they couldn't take the tank back, the Germans drove it into a swamp on purpose. Basically saying, if I can't have it, no one can. Finally, we have to look at this swamp shipwreck. In Istanbul, Turkey, some archaeologists were exploring a swamp. That's when they found 37 shipwrecks. These were from the Byzantine Empire. These ships were thousands of years old, but were in relatively good condition. This definitely is a fascinating peek back into history. But now it's time for you to make your voice heard. Comment below which was the scariest thing found in a swamp. If you want to see my short videos, then check out my other channel. I've been Charlie, thanks for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and if you haven't already, then what are you waiting for? Subscribe to Top 10s.